Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the experience of regret. First, I'd like to characterize regret generally, and then I'd like to explore it in terms of its authentic and inauthentic forms, as well as its constructive and destructive possibilities. And finally, in light of that analysis, I'd like to offer you some concrete suggestions about how you can work with regret as it appears in your own life. Here's an overall picture of where this video will go. I'll leave it up for a few seconds. If you want to look at it in more detail, you might want to pause right about now. Anyhow, like I was saying, I'd first like to characterize regret in its generality. Let's start by differentiating regret from shame. Although in English these terms overlap somewhat, it seems to me that shame is a more social phenomenon, whereas regret is more internal and individual. Basically, we shame other people as a way of trying to get them to feel some measure of regret. In other words, regret is the internal emotional mechanism that shaming attempts to take advantage of. Another thing to say about regret at the outset is that it requires the ability to reflect upon our actions. Without that ability, which not everyone has in equal measure, there's no opportunity to feel regret. However, regret requires more than the simple ability to reflect. It also requires the ability to judge and evaluate the moral or ethical quality of our actions, which, once again, not everyone possesses in equal measure. And of course, when we regret something, that evaluation is mostly negative. We regret things we'd wish we'd done better, or at least differently. That is, we judge our actions in the past from the vantage point of the present, and find those past actions wanting or wrong somehow. In this way, regret is about becoming our own judge, jury, and jailer. And the penitence we must serve always involves the sting of painful emotion. But what exactly are the qualities of that kind of emotional pain? What makes the pain of regret different from other kinds of emotional suffering? I would say first that the pain of regret is the pain of judgment and condemnation. It's about discovering that we weren't quite as good as we wish we were. It's about a kind of shortfall with respect to our expectations and desires for ourselves. However, at a deeper level, regret is about evaluating the actual substance of our lives and finding that we didn't succeed in fulfilling our possibilities with the best of who we can be. Basically, regret is about evaluating ourselves with respect to our past possibilities. But, of course, it's also about evaluating those possibilities from the position of a relatively improved present. It's about comparing who we were in the past to who we are now. And in that regard, regret is part of the price we must pay for growing beyond ourselves as the years pass. It's the harrowing cost of learning to see things more deeply, more powerfully, and with greater acuity over time. To change, to grow, to pass beyond our limitations is of course a wonderful thing. But to transcend ourselves is also to be haunted by the shadows of our earlier unfulfilled possibilities, by the fugitive whispers of what could have been, and by our stillborn better destinies in this world. To feel real regret, alive and upon us like a ravening animal, is in its way to grasp the reality of our lost innocence, to recognize that the irresistible tide of time has changed us, worn us away moment by moment, and carried us beyond ourselves into a strange and uncertain sea. This, too, is part of the undercurrent of longing and nostalgia that courses through our moments of regret. If only we had been wise enough to see things differently. But the hard truth is that we weren't that wise. And most of us know these sensations all too well. As we saw earlier, that's first because most of us possess the reflective capacity that regret requires, along with the ability to evaluate the moments of our lives along some sort of moral or ethical gradient. However, it's also because we all have plenty of reason to feel regret in our lives. That's ultimately because we're flawed, imperfect beings, and we consequently behave in flawed, imperfect ways some fair fraction of the time. Of course, when we're deep in the well of our sorrow, it's probably tempting to think that all the things we regret are indelible black stains on our souls. However, the reality is that we all have occasions to regret. Far from being stains on our souls, our regrets are just part and parcel of being human. This is important because the thing that makes regret hard to endure is the sensation that we're somehow alone in it. But the wider reality is always that we live our lives upon the broad expanse of many kinds of experience, one of which is regret. And as we saw earlier, regret is simply part of the price we must pay for growing beyond ourselves over time. Regret is the price of vision. However, just because we pretty much all have reason and occasion to feel regret doesn't necessarily mean that our regrets are genuinely our own. For instance, as we saw earlier, shaming often plays upon our sense of regret. And when we're being shamed, it's usually just a manipulative way of trying to get us to obey someone else's values and agenda. And by the way, if you want to hear a fuller analysis of why shaming people is a poor way of getting them to change and grow, you can take a look at my video entitled Shame and Privilege. Anyhow, the point is that sometimes our regrets are about falling short of values that are genuinely our own, but other times they're just a symptom of our having adopted values that really belong to other people. So, it turns out that our regrets always present us with a tricky puzzle. Whose standards are we really failing to meet when we feel regret? Our own or someone else's? Another way of posing this same question would be, are our regrets authentic or not? Authentic regret can easily become a form of existential guilt, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but simply a kind of indebtedness to our deeper possibilities in life. However, the unpleasant truth is that a lot of the time, we're probably just living out other people's regrets for them and unwisely shouldering the emotional burden of their way of seeing life. But the problem is that it's not always easy to tell whether our regrets are authentic or not. This is one reason, among many, why it's important for us to know ourselves as well as we possibly can, so that we can live toward the possibilities that are genuinely our own, and let go of the unnecessary burden of trying to fulfill other people's values for them. After all, the whole point of this life is for us to be what we actually are, not to pretend to be what someone else is or what someone else wants us to be. However, perhaps the more vexing riddle of our regret has to do with whether it's serving a mostly constructive or a mostly destructive function in our lives. And here again, the answer isn't necessarily clear or easy. Of course, popular wisdom would tell us that it's best to live simply without regrets of any kind. However, this formula neglects the positive effect that regret can have in our lives. For instance, when our regrets are authentic and when they're comparatively unobtrusive and transient, they can call us toward living in ways that are better than what we've experienced in the past. For instance, if we get drunk and act like a horse's ass at a party, regretting it later can help us avoid repeating that sort of thing in the future. In other words, sometimes our regrets can actually help us become better people. Sometimes they tell us where our faults and foibles lie and consequently where we can do work to improve ourselves. However, a lot of the time it doesn't seem to work that way. A lot of the time our regrets are little more than chronically toxic ruminations, sensations that weaken us more than they strengthen us. And that's where the popular logic of no regrets seems to become convincing. In that case, our regrets are ways of wallowing in our deficiencies rather than a springboard for overcoming them. They become vehicles for paralysis, debilitation, and the illusory allure of relief through various forms of addictive behavior. Okay, At this point, I'd like to move toward offering you some concrete suggestions about how you can work with, not against, regret as it appears in your own experience. And I'll be breaking these suggestions down in terms of the analysis of regret we've already covered. However, I should probably preface this by saying that a lot of what I'm about to say depends upon our capacity to know ourselves. That is, our ability to accurately perceive what's really going on in our hearts, minds, and souls. In my experience, one of the best ways of cultivating this ability is through meditative practice. That's because when we empty ourselves of all of the things that usually clutter our awareness, we have the chance to notice who and what we really are and what forces are guiding us as we move through our lives. So, with all of that in mind, if you find in your heart that your regrets are genuinely your own and not merely the product of indoctrination of some kind, then my advice would be to see if you can let those regrets really affect you and change you, especially at the level of your fundamental values and direction in life. In that case, your regrets are probably life's way of beckoning you toward its greater depth and toward the greater possibilities that are part of your unique human birthright. So, see if you can find the courage to let that process happen. On the other hand, if you discover that your regrets are mostly inauthentic, or that you've been shamed into feeling a lot of regret, then I would say that your task is to see how much of that you can let go of. This is especially true if you find that your regrets are paralyzing or debilitating you. Of course, letting go of this sort of regret is much easier said than done. So, how can we move toward letting go of those kinds of regrets? The first thing I'd say is that it's a bad strategy to try to banish those regrets willfully or forcefully from our lives, or to pretend like they just don't exist. Doing that just drives them further underground, underneath the surface of our awareness, where they can rule us even more thoroughly than they ever have before. The best way is, paradoxically, to become repetitively and mindfully aware of our regrets as they're happening, until they eventually lose their power over us. In other words, the point is to wear out our regrets, not to indulge in the fantasy that they have no power over us. So, when you find yourself plagued by regret of the type I'm describing, the type that's not truly your own and that exerts a corrosive effect on your life, try saying to yourself something like, "This is me, feeling debilitating regrets that actually belong to other people." Say it over and over as long as you're feeling it. Allow yourself to get thoroughly and utterly sick of it all. And I bet that after a while, you'll find that those regrets plague you far less than they did before. Another thing that can help with that process is to allow ourselves to become aware of how our regrets can easily become a mode of attachment, a way of keeping ourselves tied to and ruled by the ugly, unpleasant moments of our lives, mostly by reliving them painfully and ineffectually in our memories again and again and again, but without the element of mindful awareness. In that instance, it's often important to become aware of how we're secretly attached and clinging to what we regret. As so often happens in human affairs, it's easy to feel a hidden attraction to what repels us on the surface. And realizing that is important because we're typically ruled most thoroughly by what we refuse to recognize or accept about ourselves. So, naming things for what they actually are, especially repetitively and mindfully, can be a good way of starting to move beyond them. Of course, it can be a difficult thing to admit that we're actually clinging to what we find painful and repulsive about ourselves. So let me just pose this as a playful question, as something just to wonder about, rather than as something you should take way too seriously. Could it be that at some hidden level, you're actually clinging pretty tenaciously to your regrets, and that's what's making them seem so powerful and inescapable? Here again, I find that one of the best prescriptions for getting past that kind of clinging is meditative practice. First, because it helps us become aware of our clinging, and then because it provides a way of helping us exhaust that habit over time. And finally, let me end this video by describing a kind of trap that can happen when we're haunted by way too many regrets, way too often. The trap is that at some point we can start to regret the fact that we experience so much regret. A kind of regret about our regrets. I call this a trap because it can easily become a way of regretting our lives themselves, as opposed to simply regretting particular unpleasant moments we've experienced. At that point, the entirety of our lives can easily become thoroughly colored with the gray and black of our regrets, which can then paralyze us all the way down to our souls. However, if you're experiencing regret of that sort, the first thing I'd say is that this too is something very human. And the way out is, as usual, to become mindfully aware of it, to live through it, moment by moment, until we eventually live beyond it. But, as with so many other things in life, all of this might mean that what we really need underneath it all is to cultivate real courage. The kind of courage that's far deeper and far more potent than anything we're able to imagine for ourselves. Because, in the final analysis, discovering that kind of courage isn't the antithesis of our regrets, or merely an antidote for them. It's what is necessary for us to be unusually honest about them, honest enough to start finding our way through them day by day. In other words, often enough, our regrets are what's calling us to access our inner reservoirs of courage. The kind of bravery that lets us be direct and forthright about ourselves. The courage to change ourselves and to let ourselves pass beyond the constraints that typically bind us and keep us smaller than we really need to be. Underneath it all, our regrets might simply be life's way of telling us that we need to learn to live with real heart, in spite of all of our past histories and habits, and in spite of all of our seemingly convincing reasons not to. Just a thought. Enjoy the day.